Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the distinction between capitalism and socialism. And, I've talked about this distinction many times before on this channel. I'm kind of beating a dead horse at this point. But I think I've kind of refined an argument here that will hopefully help you see that this distinction between capitalism and socialism is actually an illusion. And this illusion ultimately developed due to a failure to understand the psychology that we all share. And we've ultimately failed to understand the implications of that psychology turning against itself, right? In other words, we all share the same psychology, and we've kind of failed to understand what happens when we turn that psychology against each other. But to kind of get to that deeper psychological framework, let's first talk about what capitalism is. So capitalism is an economic system that uses free markets to distribute the means of production, right? And on the other hand, socialism is the opposite, right? Socialism argues that the government should involve itself to some degree or another in the distribution of the means of production. Now, some socialists will argue that maybe the government should just involve itself in markets that produce necessities. And that's what I would perhaps argue if I was to kind of steelman the socialist argument. I would say that I would say that the government shouldn't mess with markets that produce luxury goods. So, in other words, the government should not regulate markets that produce diamond rings and sports cars, because we don't need those things, right? We can get by in life without a diamond ring or a sports car. But we can't get by without food, water, and shelter. And if the capitalist free market is exploiting consumers in those markets that produce necessities, then people are going to sign into any amount of debt to acquire those necessities, right? So if you need a house to survive, you're gonna sign a mortgage. If you need a food, you're gonna put that food on a credit card if it's the difference between you surviving and you starving. So, in other words, the socialists, at least the less radical socialists, argue that we do need to regulate markets that produce necessities to ensure that we're not just running the debt up and destroying our economy in the long term. So what we have to kind of go back to capitalism, though, briefly. We also have to realize that the capitalist it doesn't completely dismiss the role of government. The capitalists require government. And what the capitalist requires government for is to defend private property rights, right? In other words, you need a military or a police department to defend your right to private property. And how does the capitalist fund this defense? Well, they've socialized the defense, right? In other words, the capitalist uses socialism to defend private property rights. This is what taxes do. The taxes fund the military or the police department. So this is a contradiction in capitalism. There are perhaps very, very few pure capitalists, because in order for the capitalist model to work, they have to have a government that defends the private property rights, and that the government is ultimately, again, is funded by the masses. It's funded by taxes. So the capitalist has socialized the provision of the defense of private property. So this is a very important thing to understand, because why does the capitalist have this motivation? Why does the capitalist feel the need to fund a government to defend private property rights? Well, because the capitalist perceives private property rights or private ownership as the thing or the framework that provides them with their needs. And likewise, the socialist sees government as the thing that must regulate those markets that produce those needs when the markets get a little overzealous and they start profiteering off of the populace, right? Or off of the consumers. So there's like an ebb and flow here. When the free market capitalists that produce necessities get overzealous and they start exploiting consumers, you're naturally going to see a pushback from the socialists, who seek to gain control of the government to regulate those markets. And likewise, if that government becomes overzealous and it starts taking all of this, it starts using its power to infringe on the rights of the free market capitalists, then you're going to see a pushback against the socialists, right? So again, it's an ebb and a flow. There is actually no distinction between these two things. What everyone is actually doing is defending themselves from their fear of scarcity. And there's two competing models on how to do that. One is to use the force of the government to defend private property, and when that force gets a little too powerful, you have to counter it with government force, right? Because the government kind of has an authority, or not an authority, it kind of has a monopoly on force. It doesn't actually have a monopoly on force because ultimately crime exists, but in terms of kind of absolute force, the government kind of has a monopoly. The government's going to win the fight if it wants to. So we have to realize that the capitalist inclination to use government and the socialist inclination to use government comes from the fact that the government is being used, period. The government is the kind of, it does have the authority and the monopoly to use, the monopoly on force, it has the authority to use force. And when we use government, when we use force, when we justify the use of force to ease our fear of scarcity, there's going to be a tug of war over that force. It's inevitable. So I'm not telling you to be a capitalist or a socialist. I am telling you to understand the underlying fear that drives our desire to seek control over others through the government or through the force. If we acknowledge that underlying fear, that underlying psychology, and you empathize with the socialist or the capitalist on the other side of the supposed spectrum, then you'll realize that you're fighting yourself by using force. If you justify the use of force, you are creating fear, right? The socialist fears the capitalist's use of the government to defend private property to the extent that they can't afford necessities. And likewise, the capitalist fears the socialist's use of the government to the extent that the government steals all of the capitalist's private property. So it's just fear. It's just this underlying sociology of competing fearful mindsets. If we actually realize that psychology and understand it deeply and acknowledge the fear of our opposition, then we will see the greater pattern of mutually assured destruction that is only avoidable if we stop using the force. So ultimately, I'm a kind of an anarchist. I'm like a social anarchist. I'm a libertarian socialist, you could say. And what that means is that we kind of have to choose voluntary socialism, because when we force involuntary socialism on the capitalist, or when we force involuntary capitalism on the socialist, we hinder our collective desire to simply acquire our needs to survive. Look at all of the fucking abundance today. Look at all of the technology that, look at the excavators that replace 100 men with shovels. One man in an excavator replaces 100 men with shovels. And yet somehow we are still fighting over all of this stuff we have. We are still trying to claim ownership of everything because we fear a scarcity of necessities. And yet we have a greater capacity for abundance today than we've ever had before. If you become conscious of that abundance, of that capacity for abundance, then the fear will leave your psychology. It will leave your psyche. And from there, we can just breathe a little bit and forgive the capitalist or the socialist on the other side of the political spectrum, forgive the Democrat or Republican, and we can just enjoy the abundance. This can only come through the understanding of the psychology. It can't come through any economic framework. All of the economic frameworks are downstream from that psychology, from the sociology. The sociology is essentially the interactions of the independent psychologies. When you see the greater pattern of mutually assured destruction, it leaves you only one option, and that is cooperation. If we choose that cooperation to leverage it into the abundance that our technology offers, then we can use all of this technology to improve all of our standards of living. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the bottom is physiological necessities, right? That bottom rung of Maslow's hierarchy is the rung that socialists are trying to use the government to provide for, right? The next rung above that one is called safety. And safety is the rung that capitalists are trying to use the government to acquire in order through that defense of private property. The need for safety and the need for physiological necessities should all be on one level, right? We all need safety and we all need physiological necessities. And if we build that foundation of that pyramid out, then the higher levels of the pyramid, the belonging, the companionship, the self-actualization, the self-esteem, all of that will just naturally fall into place. And it will fall into place in a stable manner. But instead, what we're doing right now is we're seeking materialism in order to acquire self-actualization while the bottom of the pyramid is collapsing. We are taking the bricks needed at the bottom of the pyramid and we're putting them on top, and we're essentially playing Jenga. We're playing Jenga with the economy. We're playing Jenga with our needs. We're taking the foundation and we're putting it at the top, and it's essentially building an upside down pyramid. It's not going to work. An upside down pyramid will collapse. But the strange thing is that in that collapse, everything kind of settles, and actually, once the upside down pyramid collapses, it's actually more stable than it was when it was upside down. It actually almost kind of naturally falls into a right side up pyramid. So again, this distinction between capitalism and socialism is an illusion. It is the government itself, it is that represents the use of force that is creating this intraspecies fear. And unless we acknowledge that intraspecies fear and the mutually assured destruction that it inevitably leads to, then there's no way out of this capitalism versus socialism argument. It will continue for decades. The power grab for the government will continue forever until you embrace the abundance the abundance that our technology offers. So give that a little thought. Thanks for watching.